I feel like we should just say that Floyd Mayweather is the fighter of the year.
Oh, yeah, that would be awesome.
For obliterating Tenshin Nasukawa with hilarious ease.
Yeah. Man, that was brutal.
That's so dumb.
Like, do you kind of feel that Floyd, A, lost control in that, and B, that I feel like Nasukawa must have just come on too hard, and he might have clipped Floyd or something and just pissed him off? Because I don't think Floyd would have... I think Floyd would have carried him a bit, rather than just stalking him down and just trying to club him with left hooks.
I don't know. Floyd's a mercurial fellow. I don't know what he would do in those circumstances. Like, he can absolutely be an asshole with a temper. So it wouldn't surprise me if he was coming in expecting more of an exhibition. But maybe he was like, I don't know, maybe he wanted to prove a point or some shit. I have no idea.
Yeah, someone, I think it was Ryan Wagner on Twitter, had the excellent point that it might have been Tenshin's soft womanly features that enraged Floyd and caused him to go all out.
Tenshin's too pretty, and Floyd just had to thrash him. Yeah, that's a fair point. I think he might be onto something
beautiful again.
Hello. Happy New Year, and welcome to the first episode of Heavy Hands of 2019 and the last in the show's run. Phil, I hate to break this news to you this way, but this is it.
Oh well.
All right.
We had a good one.
Yeah.
We got to review some Kevin Holland fights. We got to, we got to see the rise of the most entertaining man in MMA today. What can I say?
I like how the very first thing you say to salve the wound is, well, we got to talk about Kevin Holland a couple times. No, the show will continue, I think. But we're going to be talking about UFC 232 on this episode. I just want to say, because you mentioned Kevin Holland and got my brain thinking about it, next week we are going to be doing the 2018 handies. We are going to be giving out loads and loads of handies and honoring all of our favorite fighters, fights, and what have you. Kevin Holland is going to win every category, not to ruin too much of the suspense. But if you want to challenge us to see how many kinds of categories we can pick Kevin Holland for, then you should get at us on Twitter. I looked up the hashtag 2018 handies, and there's nothing egregious or sexual whatsoever to be found, which means it is safe for you to use that hashtag 2018 HANDIES, to suggest categories for us. Possibly more interesting ones than the typical best fighter, best fight, breakout fighter, best knockout, best submission, yada, yada, yada. Whatever interesting curated categories you can come up with, submit them, and we'll pick our favorites and sort of add those to the list and make the year-end awards a little more interesting than just the usual pablum. But this is the UFC 232 recap episode, the long-awaited return of Jon Jones and the long-awaited rematch between Jon Jones and Alexander Gustafsson topped the card. Of course, Amanda Nunes and Chris Cyborg had a super fight in the co-main event that everyone saw exactly that it would go out, play out the way it did. That was very predictable. That was what we all expected. Alexander Volkanovski knocked out Chad Mendes in a hell of a fun fight, cementing himself as a top contender at featherweight. And really, except for the one predictably bad fight, that, Phil, do we even have to mention it by name?
Well, I mean, actually, think about it, there were two. And they were the big boys.
Yep, the light heavyweights.
Yep.
And the heavyweights, I guess, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, the big ones. But even Latifi Anderson wasn't terrible. It was all right. It was a very mediocre fight. And I think, the featured prelim...
The Cincinnati of...
Yes. Okay, all right, let's not make this a meme. Fights. All right. Cincinnati's pretty cool, all right? We have this stuff that we call chili, and it's not really chili, it's like a meat sauce. But anyway, we're going to talk about UFC 232, and we're going to start off with the main event, as we do. Jon Jones, Alexander Gustafsson. Phil, we sort of posited last week our theory that the first fight was not as close as everyone said. I wrote an article last week that sort of argued the same point and talked about, why the fight may have been perceived as contentious as it was, even though in retrospect, I think to a lot of us now it looks like, well, this looks like a Jon Jones win. Close. Gustafsson surely pushed him more than anyone else ever had or has, including Gustafsson himself in the rematch. But a clear Jon Jones win. This, however, there can be no argument. Jon Jones looked pretty damn good in this fight. And I think we saw, I think the crux of our predictions, if I had to summarize it last week, would come down to Jon Jones. The style matchup has not changed. Jon Jones has improved in many of the areas that caused him to struggle so much with that style matchup, and Gustafsson doesn't seem to have improved nearly as much. And I think this is how that fight looked. It looked like Jones just a sharper range striker than he was then, and Gustafsson more or less the same fighter, and really, really struggled to get much going. Got some good shots in, but more or less it was very clearly Jones's fight all the way up to the third round finish.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things that I thought of is that this was really the fight that people expected their first fight to be.
Sure.
I mean, if you looked at the predictions before that fight, before their first bout, it was mostly, I think Jones will pick him apart. In the end, the wrestling will be too much for him, and I probably expect him to win by ground and pound TKO.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, it ended up being like a competitive range kickboxing match. And then this one, people expected a competitive range kickboxing match. Instead, it was Jones picking him apart and winning by ground and pound TKO.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think it's definitely just down to the fact that Jones has improved and Gustafsson just kind of hasn't.
Yeah. I mean, there are some fundamental problems with Alex's style that, there is also, he did have a story in the Swedish media where he talked about suffering a groin injury in the first round, which maybe impacted his ability to stop takedowns or move around. But I mean, I can take that into account. It sucks, but also I do think we very clearly saw the improvements of Jon Jones, whether or not Gustafsson was compromised. Let's talk about those. What did we see here that we didn't see out of Jones in the first fight? What made this style matchup so much easier for him?
So I think it was his footwork and his ability to maintain the right slice of range, because this is what allowed him to basically kill Gustafsson's jab this time.
Yeah.
And Gus got almost no clean jabs off on Jones. He was always just punching into Jones's hands, and Jones was just catching them and just using that to test it and just move back. And so it reminded me of what we learned in JDS Overeem and Pettis Holloway, which is that bad footwork is bad footwork, whether you're going backwards or whether you're going forwards.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, we've seen Gustafsson, his footwork disintegrate under pressure multiple times, but we saw that it's not particularly much like Pettis and JDS. It's not very good for pressuring either.
No, definitely.
It really only works. He only works in a vacuum, in a defined mid range. So, yeah, Jones's ability to take small steps, he would just circle the same way the whole time, and would just accelerate back out of range if Gustafsson looked to be closing in, and he was able to expose things like the fact that Gustafsson doesn't really have much of Gustafsson didn't have the footwork to be able to close in and get past Jones's defense with a hook very often, and he also doesn't have a right hand, because when or at least not so much a reliable right straight.
Yeah.
So when Jones is doing that thing of where he's moving away diagonally to his left, and he's got his right hand up to catch or parry the jab. One of the solutions to that is just the old Tyron Woodley, Rashad Evans, tap, tap, tap with the jab and then just bang with the right hand as, straight down the line as he moves away down it. And Gus just can't really do that. He doesn't really have that punch in his arsenal.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen some killer straight rights out of Gustafsson. I think it looked more like he had a really hard time setting it up. Yeah. Not being able to land with his jab early, I think, did really throw him off. But I think I kind of agree with your assessment. Like, it really came down to Jones's footwork. Like we've seen Gustafsson line up that punch and land it, but have we seen him line up that punch and land it against an opponent with his frame who is moving his feet correctly? Like, taking small steps, more or less maintaining the same distance between both feet at all times, always balanced and in position to respond. Like, just with a good passive defense that you get from having a proper stance, that Jones just didn't have to abandon that. And so just by moving, like the same way, basically just circling to his left the whole time, Gustafsson couldn't do anything but follow him. And because his jab wasn't landing and Jones was doing a great job, we'll talk about this more, but Jones was doing a fantastic job of responding with his jab, and punishing Gustafsson for reaching out and giving him the range. He couldn't line him up for shit. He just couldn't line him up for anything. I think, like, a very strong contrast, if you go back and rewatch their first fight, pointing out that, like, I think it was clear in that first fight, Jones was uncomfortable in his first bout against someone who had a reach similar to his. It threw off what was at the time still a fairly underdeveloped mode of footwork, I think, where he sort of had the luxury, being such a long fighter, of just standing as far away as he wanted from his opponents, and they had to try to come in. And so you could just stick something out there and they would run into it. Really, really, he always made it look super easy to just run his smaller opponents into strikes and pick them apart from range. And against Gustafsson, it really exposed the flaws in his footwork and his positioning, because he was like writhing around uncomfortably, totally unsure when a punch was close enough to connect and when it wasn't. Didn't have the tools in his arsenal, at least at the start of the fight, to determine the range and set it for himself. And he definitely built up to that as the fight went on. Like, you look at the 4th and 5th rounds of their first bout at UFC 165, and it looks a lot more like what Jones is doing here. He sort of discovered the winning methods, where he would just pierce Gustafsson with the interruptive jab as he retreated. He became much more comfortable sort of hanging around right on the edge of range and throwing his own straight punches in response and mixing up his kicks beautifully, as he always does. But here, from the get-go, this was like the second time, thinking back to the Cormier rematch, we've seen Jones rematch an opponent who gave him some difficulty and just crank up all the factors that eventually gave him the advantage to the max. Where here he was moving really subtly and efficiently. I don't think Jones gets enough credit for this, but he's renowned for his stamina, but it has to do with how efficient he is. He's a very relaxed fighter who does not make a lot of extraneous movements. Like, honestly, that first Gustafsson fight was probably the most exaggerated his movement has ever been, because he was responding to how uncomfortable Gustafsson's reach was making him, I think. But just a really poised, confident sense of range.
Yep. Just in his response to strikes as well. He would still be, reaching out to parry a lot of the times, but his eyes were always on target.
Yes.
He didn't freak out and run away, which he did, a couple of times in their earlier fight and in his career before then. He just, he would constantly be stiff arm, parry, and then lean and retreat. He doesn't really have a deep bag of defensive tricks, but he never abandoned them. That was the key thing. Yeah. He was always confident that they were going to work, and he was putting
them together. Like, he does a much better job than he ever used to of, all right, I'm pulling away. Okay, that punch might hit me. I'm slipping. And as soon as I'm done slipping, I'm stepping back out of range. Gustafsson caught him by surprise a lot in their first fight, because Jones would respond to something and then be like, oh shit, I forgot his arms are really long. He's still able to hit me and he's still throwing punches. And here, like, Gustafsson talked about how he wanted to throw more combinations and put more pressure on Jones. He just couldn't. He wasn't finding the mark with his first punch or his second punch nearly often enough to have the confidence to let 3 and 4 go. So
yeah, he ended up throwing much less combinations.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, and I think the commentary team picked up on it. Gus got frustrated by his inability to cut Jones off, so he just started trying to basically step to the outside of him by going southpaw, and then Jones would just boot him.
Mm-hmm.
He would just boot him in the guts.
Yep.
And yeah, I mean, it's a unfortunate is not the right word, because that implies a sort of lack of culpability, because John Jones's problems are his own, and he has brought them on him. But I don't know, it's sad that his career has become, his wins have all received these large, significant asterisks.
Yeah.
At the point where he is putting on, genuinely masterful performances.
Mm-hmm.
This and the Cormier fight are undoubtedly his best performances.
Yep.
I mean, perhaps not in a kind of, what the fuck, this guy is a complete monster, Shogun who are hideous beating kind of way, but in his
perfectly
bringing
complete
together of all the different elements of his game.
Yeah.
And, we mentioned this earlier, the clinch entries, the takedowns, we haven't seen Jones do that kind of work for literally years.
Yeah, this is something that you have pointed out about Jones. I mean, it's one of the main things you were like, I think Rumble will knock out Jones.
Yep.
And other difficult matchups that you've sort of predicted or at least alluded to. And it was always, I think, it largely came down to not having like the interstitial pieces of his game, that opponents have to fight his fight if he's going to be able to clinch them. You talked about it last week. The reason that Jones has this reputation for taking on people in their toughest area is because his style is so reactive. If you're staying at range, Jones is going to strike with you at range. If you're pushing forwards, you're going to walk into the clinch. But he has never, before this fight, notably moved aggressively into the clinch the way he did here. Like a thing I noticed, again, it's funny that Jones talked about how he shouldn't have done so much boxing before the first Gustafsson fight. This time, his remarks were, I guess all that boxing in the garage paid off. But genuinely, boxing into wrestling positions, he did it perfectly here. He did a lot of times. He would slip under a jab and then just slide up the length of the arm into the clinch or into a takedown attempt. He hit a nice reactive takedown. We don't see a ton of those out of Jones to finish the fight. Exactly the kind of takedown Gustafsson tends to surprise wrestlers with.
I mean, when have we seen like Jones with, was it a double leg? Was it a reactive double leg that he hit him with, or was it something?
Yeah, it was a double.
Was it like a knee tap?
Pretty sure it was a double.
When was the last time we've seen Jones hit a double leg on someone? Was it like Rampage?
Probably. It's been a while.
Yeah. I mean, it was just an amazingly impressive performance. It was a synthesis of sort of his best earliest, his great earlier work and his, the style he's been building towards in more recent years. I mean, what more can you say about it? It was incredible, and it's very difficult to feel happy for him because
he's John Jones.
Yeah, because he's John Jones.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I guess that's about it. I mean, I do want to say, by the way, like, I think I called like on YouTube last week's episode, Blame John Jones or something like that. But I'm a little disappointed that everyone's ire has been directed for all of the shit surrounding this event. Everyone's ire has been directed more at John Jones than at the promotion itself. Because John Jones didn't make them move the card on a week's notice and not tell any of the athletes participating in it. Like that wasn't Jones's doing. That was the doing of the people who are trying to exploit Jones, irrespective of his many foibles, and just want to make as much money off of him as possible. But like, as you said, I'm not mad, John. I'm disappointed. It sucks that there's all these stains on his career, and you can never just fully enjoy his fights the way you might want to, because it was a complete performance, a really, really well executed fight where he just, Gustafsson still had some problems to pose, but none of them troubled Jones at all. He knew how to respond to everything, and he just methodically built his way to a win piece by piece until he got it. And, by the way, on the note of Jones, these last two being two of Jones's most impressive performances, they are also the return of Jones as a finisher, where he has looked both more composed and relaxed and, as a result, more dangerous.
Yep. Scary thoughts.
Yes.
For those who are going to be fighting him. I mean, do we really need to watch Anthony Smith fight John Jones?
Yes. No, the answer is yes.
I guess we do.
I'd rather see that than Jones Cormier 3. All right. Don't make DC do it. All right. He doesn't deserve it. I don't want to see him lose again, and I'm confident he would lose again. I just don't want to see it. Lionheart versus Jones. Make it happen, Dana. And let's take a break. When we come back, the rest of this, frankly, pretty darn solid card. Chris Cyborg versus Amanda Nunez. Boy, will we have some things to say about that. And then we'll move on. Probably hit Chad Mendes' fight with Alexander Volkanovski after that. And then just sort of piecemeal pick up whatever else we liked from this card. And there, as I said, there was quite a lot of it. Condit Chiesa was not a bad fight. Peter Yan, Douglas De Silva was not a bad fight. Ryan Hall, the first TriStar fighter to ever actually make an Imanari roll work in a fight. All of that.
Is this a good thing?
All of that and more after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
Okay, welcome back to Heavy Hands. We're here in segment numero dos, and boy, do we have a co-main event to talk to you about. Chris Cyborg was, until very recently, the UFC Women's Featherweight Champion. She was defending her title against the Women's Bantamweight Champion, Amanda Nunes. And, we talked about this last week, of course, in our preview. There were a lot of areas in which Cyborg was, clearly capable of troubling Nunes. Her jab, her counterpunching, her distance management, certainly her stamina, her clinch skills, her underrated wrestling, even her quite dominant top control. All of those could have been really, really effective against Amanda Nunes, but I think she made the right choice, Phil, in deciding to swing like a maniac with Amanda Nunes in the pocket right away.
Yeah, I mean, this was clearly the right approach for Amanda Nunes, who is famously slow starting. Someone who has, she's slow starting, but she has a bottomless gas tank. Not too much of a threat in the first round in general.
Yeah, certainly not.
Historically,
certainly not as the smaller but still powerful fighter. Especially dangerous for Cyborg due to things like hand speed. I wouldn't be worried about any of those things if I were the bigger fighter fighting Amanda Nunes.
No, yeah, exactly. If I'd been advising Cyborg, it just would have been just go out there and just fuck her up. There's no way she can hurt you in this first 5 minutes. And if she does, it's a fluke, and you should just try harder.
Yeah. So strange. I don't want to take anything away from Amanda Nunes, who has compiled a remarkably impressive resume, like one that has her being considered by many now, although this always happens after like a really big momentous thing occurs, as the greatest female fighter of all time. She's certainly in talks for that claim, the greatest female MMA fighter at the very least. And yet, like, why did the fight happen like this? What happened? Why was this the fight we got? Do you have a take on this, Phil? If you had to guess what was going through, because I don't think Amanda Nunes was just responding to what Cyborg was giving her, and responded in the way we would expect Amanda Nunes to respond.
So, I mean, so we were talking about this beforehand, and I think the adjective we came out with was Brunson-esque, which is not a complimentary one in terms of describing Cyborg's strategy, and also comparing it to Miocic Verdum.
Mm-hmm.
So
very much like for Miocic Verdum, I think.
Yeah. It was bizarre to see Cyborg giving so much less respect to Amanda Nunez than she gave to the actually fairly pillow-fisted Holly Holm.
Right.
But, you know, in part, what this actually reminded me of was her fight against Jorina. Is it pronounced Bears?
Yeah, I believe it's Bears or Bars. It might be Bars. Jorina Bars.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Dutch is a strange language.
Yeah. So this was Cyborg's fight against a much more experienced striker, much, you know, that she had, where she had very little chance of actually winning. And the thing that really stood out to me in that fight was just how little quit Cyborg had in her,
mm-hmm.
and how much she would just keep coming after Bars, no matter how, no matter how much she got tagged up. And it sort of made me think, and this fight made me think, you know, that, and that bravery was something that people didn't really seem to credit when they were looking at her run. You know, there was the kind of idea that she was just beating up on smaller women because she was, you know, huge and muscular, and then people would get mad about steroids and stuff. But, you know, she showed that she was very courageous in that fight.
Mm-hmm.
And this fight made me feel that, like, this is just the other side of that equation, because bravery can often be stupidity.
Very fine line.
Yeah, because her only path to victory against Bars was to just keep putting pressure on her and to, you know, just try and drag her into a crazy dumb fight and brawl it out with her. I'm not going to say only, because that's a tremendous discredit to Nunez, but her main path to losing in this fight was to get into a crazy brawl in the first round with Amanda Nunez.
Yeah, that's the thing, is it made sense to do that against Bars. You know, I have seen Chris Cyborg sparring competitively with Claressa Shields. Why would you think this was the way to fight Amanda Nunes? It doesn't make any sense to me. Well, we're just harping on this because there's very little to say about the fight. It was 51 seconds long.
Yeah. Most of which was like Cyborg just getting dropped repeatedly.
Yeah.
You know what? This was actually what I expected Mendes Volkanovski to look like in some ways.
Sure.
That Volkanovski was going to just try and plow forward, and Mendes would clock him with a counter, and then Volkanovski would try and double down on the pressure and get hurt even worse.
Yeah.
I mean, if Cyborg was losing this fight, I think, you know, most of us thought it was definitely going to be. People seemed to be like, Cyborg lost and by round 1 KO. That's incredible. Like, I think most of us thought if she loses this fight, it's going to be by round 1
right.
KO.
Yeah. I mean, Nunes does tend to knock people out quickly. I think she has 3 of the top 5 quickest knockouts in women's MMA or women's UFC history.
Yeah, and she's ended careers. She's left Kat Zingano permanently fucked up. She is an absolutely horrendous puncher, like, in terms of the sheer trauma she puts out. And yeah, I mean, that was pretty much it. I mean, it's interesting because Nunez is not, we've kind of talked about, not a particularly deep fighter,
right?
But she increasingly knows what her game is.
Yeah.
She's got, she can fight conservative if necessary. She was willing to brawl here. She's just got, it's very fundamental in meat and potatoes. She's got long, straight punches that have a ton of power, and it looks like that's kind of enough.
Yeah. At the very least, you can say, like, a lot of MMA fighters, their idea of developing their styles or their skill sets is to just continually add more things, which is why we now see, like, every Frankie Edgar fight includes at least one spinning back kick attempt from Frankie Edgar, even though he, like, barely knows how to throw it correctly, and it never does any damage. nor does it set anything else up that I can perceive. Like, a lot of MMA fighters get this idea in their head that they just have to start adding new techniques. You have to give credit to Nunez and her team for, like, paring her game down when her big problem was trying to do everything all the time too much to the point that she would exhaust herself. She has pared her game down to, like, the 4 or 5 things that work really well and consistently, and that make the greatest advantage of her power, her length, and her speed. So, like, there's nothing against Nunes in this performance. It's just like, it was just baffling to see Cyborg go out there, look to land a punch, get countered with one kick, and get so mad, evidently. I mean, I have to imagine there was some kind of ego trip happening here, but get so mad about that kick that she just went wild, then got dropped. And from that point, I don't know, like, I'd like to think a fighter like Cyborg, even after getting dropped, you know, at the very least, she's in good enough condition to recover quickly, where you'd think her instinct should be back off, retreat behind the jab, or go into the clinch and gather your wits. But she just kept swinging. Like, fighting's hard. It's hard to make decisions when somebody like Amanda Nunes is cracking you on the chin. But those were not the right decisions. They were not any of the right decisions. So, huge credit to Amanda Nunes. It does feel like there's still aspects of her game that some fighter should be able to exploit. But thus far, like, whether because of their own decision making or Nunes's abilities, no one lately has been able to do it. So,
yep. I mean, and this is pretty much it. I mean, there's no one else,
right?
So, I mean, there's a significant chance that Cyborg just leaves the UFC. It looks like that they might just be erasing the featherweight division. They've never particularly liked her very much.
No,
I don't think it's controversial to say. And so, you know, there's never been a great relationship between her and the UFC brass. So, if they just erase featherweight, then there is honestly, you know, who is there that can fight Amanda Nunes? Like, that's one of the reasons why we said this was a good and relevant fight, is that she's pretty much that division is pretty much emptied out right now.
I said this when they were first talking about this matchup. Like, I saw this on Twitter. It was funny to think of. In January of last year, January of 2018, I had a tweet that someone liked now well after the fact and reminded me I'd said it. Now's the perfect time to make Cyborg Nunes. Who the hell else is there in the division? What's she going to fight Pennington? And then she did fight Pennington, and then they made Cyborg versus Nunes. But, like, now she's beaten Pennington too now. So who the hell else is there? There's no one. Absolutely no one.
So they're in the same position that the lighter weight divisions were in a few years ago, where all you do is that you hope that you have your blonde, ready-made title challenger ready to go, and you know that you just keep putting into title shots until they fall apart. And for the case of bantamweight and featherweight, that was Uriah Faber. And for these weight divisions, it's Holly Holm.
Oh man, they're going to do Holm Nunes.
I mean, they're doing Lad Holm, right? So she's I believe so. So I think it's going to be the winner of that, and they're probably hoping that it's Holly Holm, and that no one looks at her record, and also that's probably going to be a really boring fight.
Yes. It will be. I will say confidently, it will be. But all right. Well, Cyborg got deaded in less than a minute. Amanda Nunes is terrifying, especially if you do exactly the thing that allows her to knock you out in a minute. How about we, before we wrap up this segment, why don't we try to cover a bit of Volkanovski Mendes as well? This was actually a really solid fight, I thought. And one that has convinced me, for 2019, Phil, my resolution is going to be to stop listening to all of your bullshit. Because you sort of helped sway me in thinking that Mendes would be too much for Volkanovski. I wasn't so sure, and I was like, it's a good case. And you were dead wrong. You're a simpleton, and that's the last that I give your opinions any credence.
I blame Chad Mendes. He's 30 shot, and if he'd been in his prime, he totally would have won this. And yeah, that's it.
Yep. If it had been Cream Mendes, he might have won.
Oh yeah, it was the psoriasis that was really got him down. He can't treat it anymore. So,
yeah.
No, I mean, I was really impressed by Volkanovski's pressure from the get-go.
He looked phenomenal. He looked great.
Yeah, very different from his previous fights, I think, in a lot of ways. Much more in and out movement, much more feints. He looked much more like Chad Mendes in the way that he was kind of feinting and approaching. A lot of people said this was like a mirror match. I don't really think these are actually tremendously similar fighters, but apart from the fact they kind of look the same and are wrestle boxers. But I thought his general, he's still not a strong defensive fighter, but he's got he's clearly getting a system. It's primarily he's just gonna block things with his with a high guard, but he was able to make Mendes very, very cautious of when it was the time to throw by just pressuring him with movement, with feints, with his own, and eventually with his jab, which was another impressive improvement that we saw.
Yeah, in the aspect that it was a mirror match, like the style of pressuring and advancing with the feints and all of the sort of erratic, tricky movement did remind me of Mendes when he is taking the lead. Did it so effectively that Mendes was almost never able to take the lead in this fight, was pretty much on the back foot the entire time. But it was definitely Mendes's style of pressure if Mendes had a jab. Because to this day, Mendes does not really have a jab in his arsenal. He has
it's always just the measuring stick.
Yeah, he always just palms his opponent's jab and comes back with his counters, which can work and has worked for him. But I think for years now, Phil, we've had people asking, what are the techniques that need developed? And the stupid, boring, pedant answer that I love to give is always, the jab still needs some developing. Like, how many fighters are there in MMA who can throw a double jab? Like, shockingly few. Things like jabs and feints, like it's, again, developing personally as a fighter is more than just about adding new techniques. It's about refining and understanding, not to be like absolute pablum, but the Bruce Lee thing about the one kick 1,000 times and 1,000 kicks one time each or whatever does apply. Because you, like with Amanda Nunes, or with Volkanovski here, you don't need a massive bevy of techniques to make you effective. It's far more worthwhile, I think, to invest your time in understanding how and why the basic techniques work and learning to apply them in all the various circumstances in which they can be applied. And the jab is the king among those things. The jab is the most flexible punch that serves so many purposes. It's so easy and efficient to throw, and it's so tricky. And because you think of it as a probing, pecking kind of shot, it's just like an opponent like Mendes. It was the perfect way to approach a committed counterpuncher, was to feint a lot and then just sting him with tricky offbeat jabs. And that's most of what Volkanovski did until he started landing the right hands, was busting up Mendes's nose and just snapping his head back just a little with jabs. And it gave Mendes a tremendously hard time of timing any counters for basically the entire fight until he got those few really clean shots in the second round. But otherwise, Volkanovski's very basic high guard was enough. And some of that has to do with the variety in Mendes's game. Like, boy, could Chad Mendes use some body punching to get around that guard. That could have been useful. But really, like, Volkanovski, I think, deserves a ton of credit for fighting exactly the way he did. And I was, of course, just joking about how I won't take your opinion seriously, but I want to back you up on that and say, you're right. Like, this was a more subtle display of striking than we have seen from Volkanovski before. He has improved tremendously. And the elements of his pressure that were effective before, like He did a really good job using his circular attacks to cut off the cage and keep the pressure on. He's got very good pressure fighting footwork. He keeps himself in a good position to prevent the opponent from escaping into open space. But he added to that with a much more subtle understanding of feinting and striking from distance, working his way inside and just striking from range. Like before, we've seen a lot of Volkanovski striking and crashing into the clinch. He was jabbing and then just stepping a half step back out again before Mendes could catch him with a counter. He did it over and over until Mendes started to slow down and he could just steadily ramp up the pressure and beat him up. It was a great performance.
I think also, got to give a shout out to Volkanovski's defensive wrestling.
Oh, absolutely.
And that he was not just stuffing takedowns, because he didn't actually stuff all that many takedowns. But it was the fact that Mendes is another guy, much like Frankie Edgar, who I get the impression has trained so much for Jose Aldo that he now has internalized a lot of anti-Aldo tactics that he just trained. Mm-hmm. And amongst this is hitting counter takedowns on kicks. Mm-hmm. And so Volkanovski, when he tried, because his two main tools for sort of sniping Mendes from the outside were the jab and the kick. And when, maybe one of the first kicks that Volkanovski threw, Mendes just immediately counter double legged him. And, but again, Volkanovski just pushed himself back to the cage, wall walked, got back to his feet. That was it.
He was so calm.
He didn't lose. And then once he stood up, he just immediately started throwing kicks again, because he'd established your counter to this is not terribly threatening to me.
Yeah.
And also I'm a cardio machine and you're sort of not. So how much is this actually, is this, if I can get up from your takedowns, then have you spent more on them than I have?
Yeah. I think
it was an interesting way that his game opened up over time.
Yeah. The thing that it really stood out, that first takedown you mentioned, he got put down in his butt. He was 10 feet from the fence, maybe a little less than that. And, he was so calm when he got taken down. It was not it was the sort of calmness that you see from Aldo when he's dealing with a wrestling attack. A different sort of response, not the same kind of explosive, ooh, my hips are instantly bouncing off the ground and you just can't keep me down for a second. But he just butt scooted right back to the fence. And I think I even caught him looking at his corner as Mendes was still wrapped around his legs. And he looked over while he was posting up and he'd reached the fence and he was like, I'm up. He nodded and said to his corner, I think, I'm up. I'm about to escape this. Don't worry. And then he did. He pulled his leg out. He had the fence in his back. It was textbook MMA takedown recovery. I don't know if you would call it takedown defense.
Yeah.
But just, you get to the fence, you post, and you stand up. And it works remarkably well if the guy's takedown is a fairly low double where he's still committed to controlling your legs. You get a leg free, you're out. And the second takedown he reversed in the second round, another big double, but he was already against the fence. So instead of posting at all, I think he did post a bit, but he just put a foot up and just sort of hipped in and ended up on top of Mendes. He made it look remarkably easy to just calmly stand up from the takedown. So yeah, it was a lot of fighting a super explosive counterpuncher comes down to, the kind of stuff Cyborg maybe should have done to Nunes, making them work more than they want to, so they have to expend energy. Volkanovski definitely did that, avoiding the worst of most of what Mendes threw at him on the feet, but it absolutely applied to the counter takedowns as well, where Mendes would put all this effort into completing a takedown, and it was a strategic win for Volkanovski, because it turned out he could just easily escape and go right back to doing what he was doing before, not having changed anything in his approach, because the counters truly were not bothering him. So, a really great show.
I do think that some of Mendes' success was a little underplayed. I did think that Mendes actually won that first round.
Oh, you did? I didn't actually, but he definitely had his moments.
Yeah, I thought a lot of his counters were actually pretty clean. I think a lot of it was that it sort of looked like Volkanovski was blocking him because he had his hands up, but I think
the sort of cuffing right hands over the top or catching him on the ear a bit, for sure.
And he was getting, and his uppercuts were generally kind of getting through the guard as they tend to. So yeah, I mean, I thought I did think there was an element that, you know, Mendes clearly has deteriorated somewhat, and in general, I've gotten the impression from Mendes that when he got out-willed by Aldo in their first fight, you know, that's the kind of thing where...
In their second fight?
In their second fight, is that you can accept being knocked out, but when you've been knocked out and you've been just kind of... just out... It's been just clearly... The difference is the other guy wants it more. That kind of stuff tends to kind of erode away at you. It becomes a little bit easier to accept the loss every time. And I think we have seen that Mendes has sort of, you know, he kind of buckled against McGregor just under the pressure. And I think this was definitely, you're like, there's just less in the reservoir these days, isn't there?
He feels himself fatiguing, and that is like, it just brings all those nightmarish memories rushing back. It's like we've talked about Thales Latis, and anytime someone connects on a jab with Thales Latis, he's like, oh, fuck the Anderson Silva fight, no. And he just goes back there immediately and just starts to crumble mentally. I definitely think there's some of that to Mendes. Yeah, after the Aldo fight, the McGregor fight, and then this one, very similar patterns of like, him having some considerable success, but the opponent just not responding with the kind of respect he wants them to respond with. And he's like, oh no, this again. They are stronger willed than me or something. So, but again, a sensational showing from Volkanovski. Before we wrap this segment up, like what do you want to see out of him next? Who would be a compelling opponent? He says he thinks he's the worst nightmare for Max Holloway. I'm not sure if I agree. Although I think he could be really compelling with that kind of pressure combined with the wrestling attack, especially if he can take a lot of shots and respond as indefatigably to Holloway's counters as he did to Mendez's. But it's a very different opponent and a whole different kind of problem to deal with. But before he gets there, presumably he's got one more win to get yet before he does that. Who would you like it to be?
I mean, it depends on where... It depends on where Edgar is, basically, right? Because we don't know if Edgar can't come back, then in time, then I suspect then Volkanovski could find himself up next. But so I think who are the choices really? We've got the huge risky one would be, but which would be a lot of fun, would be Ortega. I don't know if people necessarily want to take those kind of risks. Other than that, there's
Moicano.
Yeah, there's Moicano.
Which
how could I have forgotten?
Sounds like it would be a good fight.
That would be an awesome fight. I'd love to see that.
I want to see Volkanovski try to get past Moicano's jab, man.
Yeah.
Like
that would be
just that battle of momentum right there is fascinating to me. So. Yeah, I mean, Volkanovski, he could be fighting Holloway next. I mean, looking at the rankings, like, Edgar's above him, Moicano's above him. Moicano has a fight booked, doesn't he? Is it Moicano, Edgar? Moicano
no, he's
Stevens?
He's fighting Aldo. He's fighting Aldo, of course.
Oh, shit. All right. Well, okay. I mean, I don't know. I just want to see more of Alexander Volkanovski. Immediately when he came to the UFC, I was like, this guy's really good. And now I'm like, this guy's really good.
Yeah, he's improved like leaps and bounds in multiple fights, and now, you know, he just looked like a really powerful, physically overwhelming force, and now he's starting to look like a technically overwhelming force as well. I mean,
maybe we should have expected more of that, because they pointed out in the broadcasts, but it's worth remembering his career only began in 2011. So based on experience, at least, he should be peaking right now or very soon. So I think we're seeing that. We are seeing him come into fruition as a complete mixed martial artist, and it's exciting. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what Volkanovski can do next. All right, let's wrap this segment up. When we come back, the rest of UFC 232 still lies ahead of us. Carlos Condit versus Michael Chiesa. I guess we can talk about what Megan Anderson did to Kat Zingano. Not sure how much there is to say about that from an analytical perspective, but we will definitely be talking about the likes of Peter Yan, Ryan Hall, and maybe a couple others besides. Nathaniel Wood, there was some good shit on this undercard. We're going to get to all of it that we can after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
And welcome back to Heavy Hands. We are moving on to the rest of UFC 232, and that means, first of all, talking about the third fight, either from the start or the top of the main card, Carlos Condit versus Michael Chiesa. We didn't talk about this one last week. I think we're sort of at the point where it's like, I'm not picking Carlos Condit to win fights against any top fighters anymore. But sort of ties into the BJ Penn performance a little further down the prelims, in that at least, as you said earlier, Phil, at least Carlos looked like Carlos Condit. He looked like an older, decrepit version of Carlos Condit, but he looked like Carlos Condit. So it was a much less depressing look for him than like the Neil Magny fight, or for BJ than, the third Frankie Edgar fight. Need we even mention it? What was your take on this matchup?
Yeah, I mean, basically, like you said, this was he looked like Carlos Condit. We didn't see the guy who fought Neil Magny come out and then just kind of stand around and then lose. He came out, he looked like he was there to pull the trigger, he was there to fight. And it was less a case of him just not having the will to go out there anymore, and more just the fact that his game is kind of outdated and he doesn't have he's clearly lost something of a physical edge. I didn't look at it, and it wasn't one of those fights where I looked at it and I thought, it wasn't BJ Penn, Dennis Evil, where I just thought, in your prime, there is literally no way this fight would happen like this. Yeah. It is actually impossible.
Where in this case, like a lot of the stuff Chiesa did probably would have had some effect on Condit. Like, we've already noted this in our pre-show discussion, but Chiesa, I don't know how well this will work going forward against a lot of other opponents now that he's a welterweight. That like now leaning into his grappling even more, but Chiesa very clearly looking for what has long been one of the best aspects of his game, which is his clinch wrestling. I think we saw like against Magny, Condit was a little slower and the opponent was just too far away. So his weird, typical sort of like marching, shifting combinations where he just puts these long chains of strikes together, they just weren't finding the mark. And so he kind of stopped throwing them. Here, they kept leading him into the clinch, and Chiesa was there to accept it every single time. He would just plant his feet, sort of crudely duck his head, and wrap Condit up. And we have always known Carlos Condit as a man who struggles to defend virtually any kind of takedown. He just doesn't have very good wrestling until his butt hits the mat. Doesn't have anything in the way of solid wrestling. So, yeah, I can imagine Chiesa. I mean, I don't know if he would have won against a quicker, more dangerous, more violent Carlos Condit, but he probably would have made a lot of these same tactics work, even in Condit's heyday.
Yep. But yeah, I mean, I just felt like Condit is neither. Yeah, his issue is that he doesn't have particularly. He has mobile footwork. He's a mobile fighter rather than being one with particularly efficient footwork. Yeah. And he just doesn't have the grappling defense, and he tends to take significant risks when he gets back to his feet. Similarly, he went for his in the same way that, and he's kind of mostly avoided fighting really opportunistic submission grapplers, and we've seen that, and instead his career has mostly been defined. A lot of the time it's been defined by fighting against control wrestlers.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kind of evolved this game where he takes significant risks to get back to his feet, and at his best, it gave us great fights like his match against Hendricks. But against people like Damian Maia and Michael Chiesa, these guys are finishers. They are some real submission threats. And so we saw, I think it was Condit went for a Kimura against the cage to try and sweep Chiesa, and Chiesa just turned the grip round on him and kind of tapped him out. So, yeah, it was a bummer, obviously, and it kind of felt that this isn't necessarily similarly to BJ. This isn't just Condit being slightly shot-worn. It's also just him being a bit outdated.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
Just isn't gonna fly in the modern UFC.
I think his style used to work against those control. His grappling style used to work against those control oriented wrestlers.
Even then, it only sort of worked.
Right. But it used to have some success for the same reasons that his real A game, his striking, had success against the more like one strike at a time strikers, where he would just sort of extend the number of things they would have to react to. Condit's always been like a keep the momentum rolling kind of fighter, where he just builds layer on layer on layer, and they're not all very pretty. The cake is a little crooked when it gets put together, but damn is there a lot of cake, and he smashes it right into your fucking face, and he beats you up. So like, just keeping the momentum going as your main priority on the ground is maybe a risky way to fight. Yeah, like a venomous, opportunistic submission fighter like Chiesa. So, yeah, it was, I think he got taken down off a knee or a kick, and then he was looking for a triangle, and then he sort of looked for a Kimura from a very loose half guard, and just got quickly reversed and submitted. It's like, well, you got to have your defense in order to grapple with a guy like Chiesa. You can catch him opportunistically, but he's really dangerous in those phases. And again, credit to Chiesa for fighting a really solid fight. He countered some of Condit's weird rushes, and then for the most part, he just pushed for the clinches and took Condit down as quickly and as often as he could. And it worked. It worked like a treat. So, good showing from Michael Chiesa in his first welterweight bout. I think he's now permanently a welterweight, so I always like to hear a fighter's cutting less weight. And maybe we will get to see that striking of his that has literally never improved or developed at all come along now that he'll hopefully have less time in his camp spent just worrying about how much he weighs, and more time to focus on his technique and his fighting style. So how about, is there anything to say about Megan Anderson and Kat Zingano? She cut the woman's eye with a toenail.
Nope, it was just super weird.
Okay.
That's pretty much it.
That's it. Let's talk about Peter Yan.
This was expected to be awesome, and it was awesome.
Yes, it was. Not technically related at all, but I did enjoy Luke Thomas's comment on Twitter, which was, which of the 20 different hairstyles that Douglas De Silva is wearing is your favorite? I always enjoy his evolving look over time. He did what he could, man. He gave Yan a fairly tough fight in the first round. He caught him with some counters. He had a fairly hard time, I think, putting his combinations together, but he was doing what he could. And Peter Yan is just really good. And he is one of those fighters who becomes clearly more and more dangerous as the fight goes on. He really puts his attacks together. And I don't know, what style he's really developing into. Maybe I fixate too much on things like this, but I like to think about fighter styles. Here, I think we saw a lot of very good pressure from Yan. But his flexibility in being able to fight both off the back foot, being able to be evasive or an aggressive counterpuncher, being able to pressure or just sort of box at range, all of these things quite comfortably does make him a really difficult puzzle to solve for somewhat one-note fighters like De Silva.
The top position, ground and pound.
Oh, shit. we've seen beautiful timing on the takedowns, but his top game was phenomenal, and brutal and horrific. The ground and pound he was using.
Yeah, and as many people have done, we've got to add our own voices to the chorus of people congratulating Douglas Silva's corner for pulling their fighter out of there when it was clear that he didn't have a chance.
Yeah,
and stopping him from taking what was setting up what had already, taking more of a beating.
Yeah, absolutely. I always commend corners for pulling their fighters out of there. He was getting sliced up and blood in the eyes on the ground. Like, Jan would have just done the same exact thing, but even worse in the next round. I did think we saw some of the problems that Jan may have against other fighters here. He does get pretty predictable with his defense to strikes. He tends to kind of cover up and just duck down Gaethje style. De Silva did have some success looking for uppercuts. I think especially much longer, taller fighters are going to be able to trouble Jan based on those kinds of reactions. But the real advantage of Jan, and this kind of goes to what we saw from Volkanovski a bit, certainly what we saw from Jones with fairly basic defense, but Jan does a great job of flowing off of his defense. Like, the most impressive thing about him as a striker, I think, is how well he chains together attacks, defense, and adjustment moves without having to pause or think. He really flows really, really nicely, where if he has to duck under a punch and you stay in range, he's going to come back with a counter. If he throws that counter, he's going to come up with a defensive move or a next punch after it. He also does a really, really good job. I like this a lot, and it's not just because I always focus on jabs, but he does a great job of punctuating his combinations with jabs. Which is a technique I really like. You hit somebody with a 1-2 or a 1-2-3, and then they're like outside range. A lot of MMA fighters have this habit of sort of waiting for their turn and then trying to come back, often with the same shit you just hit them with. And Jan caught De Silva a lot of times, hitting him with a two-piece or some other strike, and then just dinging him with a quick jab as he was like at extreme range, thinking about how he was going to come back, just interrupting him in that moment of decision-making. So it was like an avalanche of mounting pressure on De Silva as this fight went on. He didn't get any moments to rest, even though Jan was pushing a hell of a pace. He wasn't being like reckless or swarming, but De Silva just didn't have any of the moments he would normally have to consider and make decisions. So everything was a rushed, panicky snap decision. It was an instinctive response more and more as the fight went on, whereas Jan was just like calculatedly picking him apart. And Peter Yan he's something else. I mean, do you have any idea of what kind of fighters he will struggle against, or what the flaws in his style that we maybe haven't seen exposed yet are?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't think there's going to be any real I don't think there's any real glaring style matchups out there that you're just like, well, this guy's going to take him out.
Right.
I think it's just going to have to be people with. I think it's probably going to come down to his defense. I think we haven't seen him against. De Silva is a high end offensive talent in the bantamweight division, but considering how how offensively gifted a lot of the top of that weight division are.
Yeah.
There's still a tier above that. So, everyone, I would still, as he called out, I would still love to see him against someone like John Lineker or Pedro Munoz in just a pure kind of firepower fight. Other than that, there's a lot of gradations of how that kind of thing works out. What about a Rob Font, for example? How does he deal with someone with that kind of reach and power?
Yeah, I have definitely been thinking about the reach. Like, Jan looked smaller and shorter armed than De Silva.
And De Silva is not
exactly
someone you think of as being
he's a fire hydrant.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's got to be some things, but like one of the most impressive things about Jan thus far has just been his like adaptability. Even if he has a tough go of it in the first, he rarely even has a bad first round. He'll have maybe a bad first minute or two sometimes, but he adjusts so well. And again, Jan is another great example of somebody whose adjustments lie in his understanding of how his techniques work and all of the applications they have, and not in how much he can throw. He's a tremendously diverse fighter. He will certainly surprise you with flying knees and wild kicks, but mostly it's like feints, jabs, double jabs into the right hand. It's mostly pretty basic shit. And he makes it look really, really good. He makes it look like he's a little short-armed Max Holloway, lining people up and then just cracking them with that rear hand over and over again. And from both stances, too, just like Max. So, Peter Yan, holy shit, would Jan Lineker be a good fight? I want to see that. That sounds really good.
Or Jan Munoz, I'm down for any of these.
Yes.
Any of these are totally acceptable to me.
Once again, and we will have more to say about this as we very quickly hit the remaining things on this card, but bantamweight, certifiably the best division in the UFC. No doubt about that in my mind whatsoever. Peter Yan is not even a ranked fighter. Bantamweight fucking owns. So, on that note, let's quickly analyze what happened in BJ Penn versus Ryan Hall. We already touched on the fact that BJ looked like himself. He didn't look the way he did in the Frankie Edgar 3 fight. He looked like he did against Dennis Seaver, which is to say, like a version of BJ Penn that is capable of losing to Dennis Seaver. So just BJ Penn, but older and worse, and outdated. What did you think of his showing here against Ryan Hall?
Yeah, it was fine.
Yeah.
Like as you said, he looked physically there. As we mentioned beforehand, I don't think there's never been a point where I'd be hugely comfortable in picking BJ Penn over someone who can kick.
Yep.
And to be honest, he actually did a pretty good job of. I think he did a reasonable job of ameliorating a lot of Hall's, rangy outside kicking game. He actually seemed ready to close the distance this time. He wasn't plodding around. He looked a bit faster, and they had some weird leg entanglement situations, and then Hall dived on him and tapped him out because he's a much better grappler than him, and BJ Penn is old, and when he won BJJ Worlds, it was years ago, and BJJ has got much better since then.
Mm-hmm. A much more modern style of jiu-jitsu from Ryan Hall. You did note on Twitter, Phil, your dismay at the fact that a TriStar fighter finally got an Imanari roll to a leg entanglement to work.
No.
Because now they're never going to stop doing this shit. I will say, like, if someone's going to Imanari roll into a 50-50 heel hook, it's Ryan Hall. So don't everyone else at TriStar get too excited. That's like one of the main things this guy does is weird leg lock entries and specifically finishing leg locks from the 50-50. His fucking school is called 50-50. Like, that's his thing. That and like inverted triangles. But it was a venomously quick submission. I'm pretty certain he tore something in BJ Penn's knee, even though he wasn't like, it was no Paul Harris. He released actually before the referee even got in there. As soon as BJ Penn tapped, and cried out as well because his knee was getting fucked up, he released the hold. But it was, you could tell one of the things, like, friend of the show, Tom Grant, like last year sometime, put a Kimura on my arm, and like you can see a lock, but when you feel a really accomplished, confident grappler apply the position in a picture perfect way, you realize like this is so tight, it almost hurts. Like there's so much control on this limb, it's not mine anymore. I don't get to decide what happens with this limb. That's how this heel hook was. Hall was in quickly, immediately had full control of BJ Penn's leg, right from the heel straight up to the hip, and just BJ tried to roll, then he tried to like roll out the wrong way. I think he was trying to kick the arm off, but it was what catch wrestlers would call a hook. He had that hold on and was immediately applying the submission. So like BJ didn't even get a second to think about kicking the arm off to free his heel. He was already being submitted as he was thinking about how to answer it. So if you're going to do an Imanari roll, that's how you got to do it. Immediately submit the person when you grab onto their leg. I think that's about it, to be honest, for us. There's a couple other fights in here that were good. We'll just have to make them shout outs rather than analysis. Phil, you were, as I was, very impressed by Nathaniel Wood's performance against Andre Ewell.
Yep.
It made somewhat less impressive. Like, it was a fairly easy pick for me to pick Wood because Ewell doesn't really know how to wrestle all that well, and certainly does not have any idea how to grapple. And but it was a phenomenally smart showing from Wood, who showed off what he could do on the feet, beat Andre Ewell up a little bit, and then took him down, controlled him, and finally finished him on the ground. Uriah Hall did hilariously hilariously Uriah Hall things to a very impressive Bevon Lewis, who seems to have, as the John Jones training partner, who has shown a lot of elements that we're familiar with looking at John Jones, seems to have accelerated. John Jones has already forged the path for how the big, tall, long striker with the clinch game style works, at least in the Jackson Wink mindset. And so having John Jones already sort of cleared the path, it's like it took Bevon Lewis comparatively much less time to get to a point where he is bridging the distance, working from mid-range, actually forcing the clinch on his opponents, and putting his strikes together comfortably. He just got clipped with a big counter right hand. And it happens. I wouldn't have seen it coming either, because Hall was not winning that fight, to say the least. And then, all these prelims were pretty good. Curtis Millender versus CR Bahadurzada. As I said on social media during the fight, CR Bahadurzada lives only to meet the man who will kill him. And so this really was a moral victory for him. But officially, it was a really impressive victory for Curtis Millender, who, let's be real, has been treated a little favorably by the matchmaking. CR Bahadurzada was taking him down and controlling him on the ground. So give Millender a capable wrestler. I think we'll probably have to slow some of the hype for him, but his striking has certainly come along. He used to be very much like a one kick at a time, really wilted under pressure. He has developed his jab and his counterpunching really, really well, and is clearly coming along as a kickboxer. And then Montel Jackson owned Brian Kelleher. All of that happened. UFC 232. It was weird. It was bad. Fuck the UFC, but it was a good card and a lot of enjoyable fights with a lot of great technique on display. So that's pretty much it for us. First episode of 2019. I hope all of you enjoyed it. And again, look forward to next week's 2018 Handies, where we will be awarding the Heavy Hands favorites for the year. Best fight, best fighter, best knockout, yada, yada, yada. Again, if you want to suggest some other bizarre categories for us to consider, do that by using the hashtag 2018 Handies, HANDIES, on Twitter, and we will take a look at those and curate our favorites. But until then, Phil, do you have anything to look out for this week?
I don't. I'm going to be taking a bit of a break this week, but I think we're going to be getting together again with our good friend Zane Simon to look at some terrible MMA. So we're going to be doing the MMA Depressed Us on Thursday.
Maybe we could watch Arlovsky versus Walt Harris.
You shut your whole mouth.
Look out for the MMA Depressed Us for sure on Bloody Elbow Presents. That's always fun to do, where we just torture ourselves by watching bad fights and trying to ameliorate our frustration by making jokes about them. That's always a good time. It's not actually, but I continue to do it. So watch it / listen to it. And as for me, I'll be having something out this week, but I don't know what it is yet. And I don't want to tease you all with something that doesn't happen. Could be a recap of Jones Gustafsson. Could be about Alexander Volkanovski. That sounds like fun. But until it happens, I'm not 100% sure. So just keep your eyes peeled. You can find all the stuff that Phil and I produce on bloodyelbow.com. Check us out on social media, especially on twitter.com. I think both of us are most active there. You can find Phil at Evil Greg Jackson and myself at Boxing Bush, BUSCH. And thank you very much for listening. Hit up the Patreon. There will be more bonus episodes coming out this week for those of you contributing $3 a month. And until next week, thanks for listening. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.